This is the second part of the Chess Basics series. And now that you know how the pieces move and capture and the chess rules, knowing a little bit about how your pieces cooperate or work together is smart. And we'll do that by learning how to checkmate the opponent king. And what you see on the board here is probably the easiest checkmate that you will encounter. If you can spot it, this is checkmate in 2 moves. But I see a lot of beginners keep checking and checking but can't checkmate. Here is an example of what I see. The rook moves, check, right? Towards the king. King moves. The rook moves, checks again, right here. King moves, queen goes, checks, right here. And what I observe is that there is no communication between the rook and the queen. And now we're going to learn how that actually works. You can checkmate the black king much faster than what I'm showing you right now. The point is, I want you to get your queen and your rook into a certain position before you start checking the black king. So your queen here goes to b3. King just moves. You move your rook away from the h-file. King goes back. You move your queen to the h-file. King moves. And you get your rook up here on g4. The point here is you want your rook and your queen on adjacent files diagonally, and you want your rook in front of your queen. You want your queen to protect your rook. Your rook cannot protect your queen in this position, but your queen can protect your rook, and that is important. And now it's a simple checkmate in 4 moves. The king moves back, and your queen here says check. Now the rook already owns the 4th rank. The queen owns the 5th rank. So the king has to move back. King moves, check again. King moves, check. You still have the same position. The rook owns the 6th rank. The queen owns the 7th rank. And the king cannot take the rook because the rook is protected by the queen. So the king has to move back. And that is a checkmate. The point to remember here is that the rook alone cannot mate the king. The queen alone cannot mate the king. We can do this another way. The queen moves to b4. The king moves, let's say, to f5. The rook moves to h5. And now you see the queen dominates the 4th rank. The rook dominates the 5th rank, and the king has to move back. King moves here. Now the rook here is about to be captured by the black king, so we need to move that rook. And we move it to the adjacent file next to the queen. And now we have the same position just on the opposite side of the board, and it's not completely on the left side, but they are adjacent and they are diagonal towards each other. King moves, and the same thing happens again. Queen, b6, and right now the rook dominates the 5th rank, the queen dominates the 6th rank, and the king has to move back. Check again. The king moves to the 8th rank, and we have a checkmate. And the king, as before, cannot take the rook because the queen is protecting the rook. We're going to complicate this a little bit now. When you're not a complete beginner anymore, you understand that your queen and your rook don't necessarily have to be on adjacent files, but they still have to cooperate with each other. And right now, what we want to do is split the king away from his pawns. So in this position, let's say white to move, we'll move the queen here, and we're blocking the black king from moving here and moving here. If black moves his pawn to a5, he's attacking the queen. But what we can do actually is take the rook, put it on f6, and right now the black king cannot move here because the queen is protecting that spot and the black king would be in check. And at the same time, the rook is dominating the 6th rank, which means that the king has to move backwards. If the king moves to c7, we automatically have the same position as before, now with the queen in front. But in this position, the black king cannot do anything about it. The black king has to move back, cannot move here, right, because of the queen, and we have a checkmate. Point being, the queen and the rook are cooperating. I'm demonstrating this by pushing the black king towards the 8th rank and then checkmating the black king, because I think it's easier to visualize it when you're pushing the king backwards. But you could of course push the king towards the left or the right side of the board also. So in this case, the rook can move to f4, check the king. The rook right now is dominating the f file, the queen is dominating the e file, and the king has to move now towards the right side of the board. The king moves to g6. We have a check again. We're still dominating the f file and right now also the g file. The king has to move even further towards the right of the board, and we have a checkmate like that with the queen behind the rook. This Chess Basics series is for the complete beginner, and that's why I would like you to start off by having your queen and rook on adjacent files, and with the queen protecting the rook by being behind it. And here's an example of what could happen if your queen is in front of your rook. And as a beginner, this position doesn't just happen in speed chess, it actually happens in tournament play. Now, the rook here goes to h5, and we have the same as always. The queen dominates the 4th rank, the rook dominates the 5th rank, and the king has to move back, right? King moves, of course, closer and closer to the queen and the rook. That's a check. The king comes closer. That is a check. The king comes even closer, and this could have been a checkmate right here, but the queen is not protected by the rook. And what happens is, of course, that the king just takes the queen. And then we'll have to start all over by moving the king up and mating with just a rook and a king. And that's it for this time, and see you next time.